The snow fell in a heavy, silent sheet, muffling the world in a blanket of white. Finian Holt stood on his porch, watching the flakes gather on the bare branches of the cottonwood, his breath a cloud in the biting air. He was a man made of the same hard, lonely material as the land around him, all sharp angles and weathered patience. For 3 years since Martha passed, the silence inside his ranch house had been as deep as the winter outside. It was a silence he had learned to endure, a cold companion that asked for nothing and gave nothing in return. Then he saw her, a small figure walking the long, snow-dusted road to his property, a splash of dark red against the overwhelming white. She moved with a steady, determined pace, as if she knew exactly where she was going, even though no one ever came out this far uninvited. As she drew closer, he saw she was a young Chinese woman, no more than a girl, really. Her face was pale with cold, but her eyes were dark and clear, holding a stillness that matched the landscape. She wore a simple prairie dress, the color of dried blood, and carried a small, tightly wrapped bundle. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, not shivering, not looking afraid, just waiting. He finally broke the quiet. "What do you want?" His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. She looked up at him, her gaze direct. "Reverend Michael sent me. He said you need a cook, a housekeeper." Finian stared. The town preacher was a meddler, but this was a new level of interference. He'd mentioned offhand weeks ago that the solitude was getting to him, that he was tired of his own sorry cooking, but he never expected this. He looked her over, so slight, so young. "I don't need charity." She didn't flinch. "This is not charity. It is work. I need work. You need a cook. It is an arrangement." Her English was precise, careful. He felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. The house was cold, empty. The thought of a warm meal he didn't have to make himself was a powerful temptation. He was lonely, yes, but admitting it felt like a weakness he couldn't afford. He grunted, turning to go back inside. "I pay $2 a week, room and board. You work hard, no trouble." She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "I work hard, no trouble." He held the door open, a gesture that felt foreign and stiff. She walked past him into the gloom of the house, bringing with her the scent of snow and a silence that was somehow different from his own. The first few days were a study in quiet observation. Leanne, as he learned her name was, moved through his house with a soft, unobtrusive grace. She found the worn-out brooms, the dusty rags, the near-empty larder, and without a word began to impose a gentle order on his bachelor's chaos. The mornings, which had always begun with the stark cold and the chore of building a fire, now started with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The scent drifted up to his loft, pulling him from sleep with a sense of reluctant comfort. He would come downstairs to find a plate waiting for him on the scrubbed, clean kitchen table. He'd eat, she'd work, and they would not speak. He watched her from the corner of his eye. He watched her hands, small but capable, as she kneaded dough for bread, her movements fluid and sure. He watched how she carefully banked the fire in the stove, making the wood last. She wasted nothing. Every scrap of vegetable, every bit of flour was used with a reverence that spoke of a past where waste was not an option. Her presence was a constant low hum in the background of his life, a subtle shift in the composition of his solitude. He found himself lingering in the main room longer than he needed to, finding small tasks to do near the hearth just to be in the same space. He told himself it was to make sure she wasn't a thief, but he knew that was a lie. He was watching her because she was a puzzle. She never complained about the cold or the sparse supplies or his own gruff silence. She simply did her work, and when she was done, she would sit by the fire with a small book of Chinese characters, her expression serene. One afternoon he came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, and found the air thick with the smell of ginger and something sweet. On the counter was a row of perfectly folded dumplings. He'd never seen anything like them. He picked one up. "What's this?" he asked, the first unsolicited question he'd posed to her. She looked up from her book. "Jiaozi. It is good for the cold." He ate one. The warmth spread through him, a savory, comforting heat that had nothing to do with the fire. He ate another, and another. He didn't say thank you, but he met her eyes for a moment, and in that shared glance, a small, fragile understanding passed between them. The house was no longer just his shelter. It was becoming a place of warmth again. A week after her arrival, a blizzard descended from the north, a howling monster of wind and snow that buried the world. The ranch was cut off completely. For 3 days the storm raged, trapping them inside the small wooden house. The wind shrieked through the eaves, and the windows became opaque with frost. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the main room, the circle of light cast by the oil lamp, and the steady, reassuring heat of the stove. The enforced proximity was a strange kind of pressure. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with things unsaid. Finian found himself restless, pacing the floorboards like a caged animal, while Leanne seemed to draw into herself, becoming even quieter, calmer. On the second day of the storm, he found her standing before the rough-hewn mantelpiece. She was looking at the small, silver-framed photograph that sat there, the only personal object he displayed. It was a picture of Martha, smiling, her hair caught in a prairie breeze. He had not moved it in 3 years. He expected Leanne to look away guiltily when she heard him approach, but she didn't. She kept her eyes on the photograph, her expression one of quiet contemplation. "She was very beautiful," Leanne said, her voice soft. Finian stopped beside her, his shoulders tense. He never spoke of Martha, not to anyone. The grief was a private, jagged thing he kept locked away. But standing there, with the storm howling outside and this quiet woman beside him, the words came out before he could stop them. Her name was Martha. He didn't say more, but he didn't need to. The name hung in the air between them, full of loss. Leanne didn't offer empty platitudes or clumsy words of comfort. She simply nodded, a small, profound gesture of acknowledgement. She was not afraid of his grief. She was not trying to fix it. She was just bearing witness to it. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and the wind moaned, he looked over at her. She was mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. He saw not just a hired cook, but a woman who understood the language of silence, the weight of memory. The storm had forced them together, but in that shared moment by the mantelpiece, something else had happened. A crack had appeared in the wall of his solitude, and a tiny, uncertain light was beginning to shine through. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was pristine and blindingly white. The road to town was impassable for another 2 days, but eventually Finian knew he had to go for supplies. The larder was getting low, and he needed grain for the livestock. He hesitated before asking her, but it felt wrong to leave her alone for an entire day. "I'm going to town," he announced gruffly at breakfast. "You can come if you've a mind to." He expected her to refuse, to prefer the safety of the isolated ranch. But she just looked at him and said, "I will get my coat." The town of Redemption was a small, hard-scrabble place where secrets were currency and judgment was swift. As they walked down the muddy main street, Finian felt the stares. He was used to being an object of curiosity, the grieving widower who kept to himself. But this was different. The looks were sharp, laced with suspicion and a cruel sort of interest. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking as they passed, their eyes lingering on Leon with a mixture of contempt and crude appraisal. The women were worse. They pulled their shawls tighter, whispering behind their hands, their faces pinched with disapproval. Finian felt a slow, hot anger building in his chest. He kept his stride even, his gaze fixed straight ahead, positioning himself slightly between Leon and the prying eyes of the town. He could feel her walking close behind him, a small, silent presence in his shadow. At the general store, the proprietor served them with a chilly reluctance. As Finian paid for his goods, a man named Jed Barrow stepped in front of them, blocking their path. Barrow was a big man who got his confidence from a bottle and the company of weaker men. He looked Leon up and down, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well now, Holt," Barrow drawled, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Didn't know you were in the market for exotic company. Where'd you find this one?" Leon went perfectly still, her face a mask of composure. But Finian saw the slight tremor in her hands. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just turned his head slowly and fixed Barrow with a look as cold and deadly as a winter frost. "She is under my protection," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Step aside." There was no threat of violence in the words, but the promise of it was unmistakable. Barrow, for all his bluster, was a coward. He held Finian's gaze for a second, then shuffled out of the way, muttering under his breath. Finian gathered his supplies, and without another word they left the store. On the walk back, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged with the echo of his words. "She is under my protection." The tension from town followed them home, a bitter chill that even the warm stove couldn't quite chase away. Back in the safety of the ranch house, Finian watched Leanne as she put away the supplies. Her movements were as precise and graceful as ever, but he could see the strain in the set of her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes downcast. He saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal behind her wall of quiet dignity. He'd seen that look on Martha's face once, when a traveling salesman had been too forward. The memory sent a jolt of fierce, protective anger through him. He had failed to protect his wife from the sickness that took her, but he would not fail to protect the woman who now lived under his roof. He walked over to the hearth, ostensibly to add a log to the fire, but his eyes never left her. He waited until she had finished her task and was wiping down the counter. "He won't bother you again," Finian said, his voice low and certain. She stopped her work but didn't look at him. "Men like that, they always bother." There was no self-pity in her tone, only a weary statement of fact. He hated it. He hated the casual cruelty of the world that had taught her that lesson. He took a step closer. "Not here," he said, the words coming out with more force than he intended. "Here you are safe." She finally looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. The word "safe" hung in the air between them, a fragile and powerful offering. It was more than a statement. It was a vow. It was a promise that went far beyond the simple terms of their arrangement. This was no longer about a warm meal and a clean house. It was about sanctuary. What do you think he's really promising her? Let me know what you think is going through his mind right now, because the story is about to change. He was promising her more than just a locked door and a sturdy roof. He was promising her his strength, his presence, a shield against the ugliness of the world. And in that moment, Finian Holt realized with a startling clarity that he wasn't just offering protection. He was declaring his loyalty. He was tying his fate to hers in a way he hadn't done with anyone since Martha. Leon held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in their depths beyond gratitude. It was a profound, unwavering trust that she was placing in his hands, a trust so complete it humbled him. From that day on, a subtle but definite shift occurred. The quiet between them was no longer just an absence of words. It became a shared space, a comfortable understanding that needed no sound. The harsh winter began to soften its grip, and inside the ranch house, a different kind of spring was blooming. The soft romance between them wasn't spoken in grand declarations, but in a language of small, deliberate actions. He started noticing things he'd been blind to before. He saw that the handle on the well pump was stiff and hard for her to work, so he spent an afternoon oiling it until it moved smoothly. He found a patch of stubborn wintergreen pushing through the snow near the creek and brought back a small bundle of the fragrant leaves, leaving them on the kitchen counter without a word. He knew she used them to make a soothing tea. He began talking to her, not just about chores, but about the land, the cattle, the way the light changed on the mountains at dusk. He told her stories of his father, who had built this ranch with his own 2 hands. In return, Leon's quiet care for him deepened. She noticed the way he rubbed his shoulder after a long day of chopping wood and would leave a hot compress warming by the fire for him. She saw a tear in his favorite sheepskin coat and mended it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned the sound of his footsteps and would have a hot cup of coffee ready the moment he walked through the door. One evening he came in, chilled to the bone, and found she had moved his armchair closer to the hearth and draped his thickest wool blanket over it. He sank into the chair, the warmth seeping into his weary body, and watched her as she moved about the kitchen. A feeling he had long thought buried rose in his chest, a tender, aching warmth that felt dangerously like hope. He was not just sharing a space with his housekeeper. He was building a home with a partner. The silence was still there, but now it was a comfortable blanket, woven through with threads of mutual respect and a deep, unspoken affection. The loneliness that had haunted him for years was finally, slowly, beginning to recede. Their fragile peace was not destined to last. Jed Barrow was not a man who forgot a slight, especially a public one. One evening, as twilight bled across the snow-covered fields, the sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. Finian looked out the window, and his body went rigid. 3 riders were approaching, their forms dark against the fading light. It was Barrow and 2 of his cronies. Leanne came to stand beside him, her hand instinctively going to the small jade pendant she wore around her neck. "Go to the back room," Finian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Lock the door." She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, but for him. "Go," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She obeyed, and he heard the bolt slide home. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood there, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, as the 3 men reined in their horses. They were drunk, their laughter loud and ugly in the clean, cold air. "Halt!" Barrow shouted, swinging down from his horse. "We've come on official town business. There's a rumor you're harboring stolen property." He gestured sloppily toward the house. "We're here to collect it." Finian didn't move. He stood as rooted as the old cottonwood, a solid, unbreachable wall. "There's nothing here for you, Barrow. This is my property. You're trespassing." "Is that what you call her? Property?" Barrow sneered. "Come on, Holt. Just send the girl out. We only want to have a little fun with her. Show her some real American hospitality." The other two men laughed. A cold, precise fury settled over Finian. He imagined breaking Barrow's jaw, but he knew violence would only make things worse. He had to end this with words, with the force of his will. "She is not property," he said, his voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. "She is the woman who lives in my house. She is under my roof and my name. You will turn your horses around and you will leave. And if you ever come back, or if you ever so much as look at her again in town, you will find out what kind of man I am when I'm not being polite." He took one deliberate step forward. In the dim light, his face was a mask of cold iron. Barrow and his friends were drunk, but they weren't stupid. They saw the absolute conviction in his eyes, the promise of a violence that would be swift and final. Barrow hesitated, the drunken bravado draining from his face. He spat on the ground, trying to save face. "This ain't over, Holt." "Oh, yes it is," Finian said softly. Barrow held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and clumsily mounted his horse. The three of them rode off, their drunken shouts swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Finian stood there until they were gone, his body thrumming with adrenaline. He finally turned and opened the door. Leon was standing right there, the bolt unlocked. She had not hidden in the back room. She had been waiting, listening, just on the other side of the door. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a look of such fierce, shining devotion that it took his breath away. The last of his defenses crumbled. The wall he had built around his heart for 3 long years turned to dust. All the unspoken feelings, all the quiet moments of shared care, coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He loved this woman. He loved her strength, her stillness, her quiet courage. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She shook her head, a small, definite movement. She reached out and her small, warm hand covered his, which he now realized was clenched into a fist at his side. Her touch was like a balm on a raw wound. "Not with you," she whispered, her voice full of an emotion that mirrored his own. "With you, I am never afraid." The simple, powerful declaration shattered the last of the silence between them. He had offered her safety, and in return, she was offering him her absolute trust, her whole heart. He looked down at her hand covering his, this small point of contact that felt more real and more profound than anything he had experienced in years. He slowly uncurled his fist and laced his fingers through hers. It was not the touch of an employer to his cook. It was the touch of a man who had found his anchor in the storm. He saw the truth of his own heart reflected in her eyes. He had hired her to fill the emptiness of his house, but she had ended up filling the emptiness in his soul. "Leanne," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know what else to say. Her name was enough. It held everything. She simply squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment, he knew he was home. The next morning, the world felt new. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter, the air cleaner. The confrontation with Barrow had been a crucible, burning away all pretense and leaving only the pure, unvarnished truth of their feelings for each other. The arrangement of employer and employee was now an impossible fiction. As they sat at the kitchen table, a comfortable silence settled between them, but it was a silence pregnant with impending change. Finian cleared his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't since he was a young man courting Martha. He had rehearsed the words in his head all night, but now they felt clumsy and inadequate. He looked at Leanne, at the gentle curve of her cheek, the quiet intelligence in her eyes. He couldn't imagine this house without her. He couldn't imagine his life without her. "Leanne," he began, his voice steadier than he felt, "what happened last night? It changes things. I can't have you here as my cook any longer. It isn't right. It isn't honest." A flicker of alarm crossed her face, a fear of being sent away. He quickly reached across the table and took her hand. "No," he said gently. "That's not what I mean. I don't want you to leave. I never want you to leave." He took a deep breath, marshaling his courage. "This place, for years it's just been wood and dirt and ghosts. A place to sleep, not a place to live. But since you came, it's become a home again. You brought life back into it. You brought life back into me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. He held her gaze, pouring all his sincerity, all his hope into his next words. "I'm asking you to be my wife, Leanne. Not as an arrangement, not for protection, but because I want to build a life here, with you. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to share my days with you, my name with you. I want to be your husband." It was a plain-spoken proposal, devoid of poetry, but it was the truest thing he had ever said. Her answer was not a word, but an action. She stood up, walked around the table, and gently placed her arms around his neck, resting her head against his shoulder. Her quiet, unconditional surrender was more powerful than any yes. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. It was a promise made and a promise accepted. Their journey back to town a few days later was a world away from their last visit. This time they walked side by side, their hands linked. The stares and whispers followed them still, but they were different now. The open hostility had been replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. News of Finian's confrontation with Jed Barrow had spread like wildfire. In a town that respected strength above all else, Finian's quiet, unyielding defense of his home and his woman had earned him a new standing. They went directly to the small church at the edge of town, to the office of Reverend Michael. The old preacher looked up from his desk, his eyes twinkling as they entered. He saw their joined hands, the quiet confidence in their faces, and a wide, knowing smile spread across his face. "I had a feeling," he said simply. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd of well-wishers. It was a simple affair, with the Reverend and his wife as witnesses. They spoke the old familiar vows, their voices clear and steady in the quiet room. When Finian slid a simple, thin gold band, his mother's ring, which he had kept safe for years, onto Leanne's finger, it was not the sealing of a contract, but the celebration of a bond that had already been forged in shared silence, mutual care, and fierce loyalty. They walked back to the ranch not as a man and his hired cook, but as husband and wife. As they stood on the porch of their home, watching the winter sun cast long, golden shadows across the snow, Finian looked at Leanne. He saw his future. He understood now that a home was not built with timber and nails, but with courage and kindness. It wasn't about the land you owned, but the person you chose to share it with. He had started the winter as a man lost in his own solitude, haunted by the past. Now, as the first hints of a thaw were in the air, he was a husband, a partner, a man with a reason to look toward the spring. He drew his wife closer, and together they watched the day end, secure in the quiet, unshakable truth of the life they would build together.